When day turns to night, and the moon is most bright, shed the king of you and wear the queen. The 9 realms will open, and your magic be free. Hi, my bling. It's your favorite drag witch, Nova Jupiter Jenkins. My friends call me Nova JJ, and you can too. If you're just tuning in, you might want to jump back and listen to the previous episodes to get caught up on the sitch with this witch. Well, here's the short version. My alter ego Adam casts a spell every full and new moon and is transported to a magical realm I call the Heath. And as he's transported, he's transformed into me, renowned book hunter and witch extraordinaire, Nova JJ. I record a podcast while I person the information desk at the library of an infinite size called Kalamudutu. Welcome to the Snow Blossom Moon. The festivities of the spring equinox are in full swing here in the Heath. We're in the midst of another supermoon, and the snow blossoms are out of control. For those of you who may not know, snow blossoms are a magical flower found in the Heath. They blossom during this particular full moon high in the clouds and descend like a beautiful snowfall, minus the annoying cold. They bloom in all different colors and glow as they fall. It's a sight like no other to behold. And then, of course, the goddess of the dawn, Ostara, or Easter as she's commonly addressed, shows up with an army of bunnies, and they eat away the blossoms before we drown in them. And as they eat the blossoms, their color changes to that of the blossom. Cute level, 1,000,000. I wish all my bling in the mundane could see it. I may have to cut this episode short to rejoin the festivities. And pardon my voice. The allergies are crazy. Okay, changing gears to a more serious note for a moment. I have another apology to give. This one is to the First Nations of North America. I've been casually throwing out the names of the full moons according to First Nations tribes, and it's not my information to give. I should have known better, and I think part of me did, but thought that it was okay because the information is so widely used and widely available, and because I consider myself an ally. Instead, I contributed to the colonial attitude that thinks that once a thing has been taken and co-opted, it's okay to perpetuate that theft. Moving forward, I'll be focusing on the names for the full moons that originate in the Heath. I hope you'll continue to join me. Okay, before we jump into story time, it's Craft Corner. Of course, spring is a time for cleaning out all the clutter that's built up over the winter, and yarn stashes are no exception. As all yarn crafters know, the battle to keep your stash from multiplying like tribbles is never ending, but springtime can be a good time to try and get ahead of the game. So I thought I would share some of my favorite stash-busting projects. First up, blankets. Blankets are one of the best stash-busting projects just because they use so much yarn. And while blankets can definitely be knit, I prefer to crochet them myself, since crochet tends to be a bit faster and sturdier depending on the stitch. I have a decent attention span, but even it can run out on a project as big as a blanket, so anything I can do to make it go a bit faster, I'm all for. Some people like to get fancy, but I love me a good old granny square. You can make the individual squares as big or small as you want, and in whatever color combination you like. For anyone who might want to learn how to crochet, granny squares are a great place to start. I'll have Adam put a link in the show notes to a good tutorial. Now, another project I really enjoy for stash busting is a Tunisian crochet project that I call the pterodactyl wing scarf. It's sort of a combination of a shawl or a scarf depending on how large you make it. And that's the beauty of this project. With a blanket, you might not have enough yarn in the color combination you want, but with a pterodactyl wing scarf, you can just go until you run out of yarn, or until it's so big you can no longer fit into your house with it. It's also one of the easiest things to make in Tunisian crochet. You simply chain 3, complete a forward pass and a return pass, and then before you complete the next forward pass, you yarn over. Repeat until the scarf is as big as you want and bind off. Simple as that. And if you alternate colors every return pass, you'll end up with a neat-looking pattern. For those who might want to try and learn, we'll also include a link to a video tutorial for the basics of Tunisian crochet. What's that, Gerald? Why don't I make my own video tutorials? Well, mainly because the spell can only transmit audio. Well, maybe. We'll see. Alright, now we can get to story time. So we're going to jump back into the Black Amazon of Mars. When we last left Eric John Stark, stranded near the polar caps of Mars after the death of his Martian friend Kamar, he had been brought to the head of the mech army, Lord Sieran. Lord Sieran asked Stark to join him in his efforts to take the city of Kushat, but when Stark demanded that Sieran remove his helmet and look him in the eyes, instead Sieran called for his men and grabbed his axe. And now, Part 3 of the Black Amazon of Mars. The flames leaped high from the fire in the windless gorge. Men sat around it in a great circle, the wild riders of the mountain valleys of Mech. They sat with the curbed and shivering eagerness of wolves around a dying quarry. Now and again their white teeth showed in a kind of silent laughter, and their eyes watched. "He is strong," they whispered one to the other. "He will live the night out, surely." On an outcrop of rock sat the Lord Sieran, wrapped in a black cloak, holding the great axe in the crook of his arm. Beside him, Otar huddled in the snow. Close by, the long spears had been driven deep and lashed together to make a scaffolding, and upon this frame was hung a man. A big man, iron-muscled and very lean, the bulk of his shoulders filling the space between the bending shafts. Eric John Stark of Earth, out of Mercury. He had already been scourged without mercy. He sagged of his own weight between the spears, breathing in harsh sobs, and the trampled snow around him was spotted red. Thord was wielding the lash. He had stripped off his own coat, and his body glistened with sweat in spite of the cold. He cut his victim with great care, making the long lash sing and crack. He was proud of his skill. Stark did not cry out. Presently, Thord stepped back, panting, and looked at the Lord Sieran, and the black helm nodded. Thord dropped the whip. He went up to the big dark man and lifted his head by the hair. "Stark," he said, and shook the head roughly. "Stranger!" Eyes opened and stared at him, and Thord could not repress a slight shiver. It seemed that the pain and indignity had wrought some evil magic on this man he had ridden with, and thought he knew. He had seen exactly the same gaze in a big snow cat caught in a trap, and he felt suddenly that it was not a man he spoke to, but a predatory beast. "Stark," he said, "where is the talisman of Ban Cruach?" The Earthman did not answer. Thord laughed. He glanced up at the sky where the moons rode low and swift. "The night is only half gone. Do you think you can last it out?" The cold, cruel, patient eyes watched Thord. There was no reply. Some quality of pride in that gaze angered the barbarian. It seemed to mock him, who was so sure of his ability to loosen a reluctant tongue. "You think I cannot make you talk, don't you? You don't know me, stranger. You don't know Thord, who can make the rocks speak out if he will." He reached out with his free hand and struck Stark across the face. It seemed impossible that anything so still could move so quickly. There was an ugly flash of teeth, and Thord's wrist was caught above the thumb joint. He bellowed, and the iron jaws closed down, worrying the bone. Quite suddenly, Thord screamed, not for pain, but for panic, and the rows of watching men swayed forward, and even the Lord Sieran rose up, startled. "Hark!" ran the whispering around the fire. "Hark, how he growls!" Thord had let go of Stark's hair and was beating him around the head with his clenched fist. His face was white. "Werewolf!" he screamed. "Let me go! Beast thing, let me go!" But the dark man clung to Thord's wrist, snarling, and did not hear. After a bit there came the dull crack of bone. Stark opened his jaws. Thord ceased to strike him. He backed off slowly, staring at the torn flesh. Stark had sunk down to the length of his arms. With his left hand, Thord drew his knife. The Lord Sieran stepped forward. "Wait, Thord!" "It is a thing of evil," whispered the barbarian. "Warlock, werewolf, beast!" He sprang at Stark. The man in armor moved very swiftly, and the great axe went whirling through the air. It caught Thord squarely where the cords of his neck ran into the shoulder, caught and shore on through. There was a silence in the valley. The Lord Sieran walked slowly across the trampled snow and took up his axe again. "I will be obeyed," he said, "and I will not stand for fear, not of God, man, nor devil." He gestured toward Stark. "Cut him down and see that he does not die." He strode away, and Otar began to laugh. From a vast distance, Stark heard that shrill, wild laughter. His mouth was full of blood, and he was mad with a cold fury. A cunning that was purely animal guided his movements then. His head fell forward, and his body hung inert against the thongs. He might almost have been dead. A knot of men came toward him. He listened to them. They were hesitant and afraid. Then, as he did not move, they plucked up courage and came closer, and one prodded him gently with the point of his spear. "Prick him well," said another. "Let us be sure." The sharp point bit a little deeper. A few drops of blood welled out and joined the small red streams that ran from the wheels of the lash. Stark did not stir. The spearman grunted. "He is safe enough now." Stark felt the knife blades working at the thongs. He waited. The rawhide snapped, and he was free. He did not fall. He would not have fallen then if he had taken a death wound. He gathered his legs under him and sprang. He picked up the spearman in that first rush and flung him into the fire. Then he began to run toward the place where the scaly mounts were herded, leaving a trail of blood behind him on the snow. A man loomed up in front of him. He saw the shadow of a spear and swerved and caught the haft in his 2 hands. He wrenched it free and struck down with the butt of it and went on. Behind him he heard voices shouting and the beginning of turmoil. The Lord Sieran turned and came back, striding fast. There were men before Stark now, many men, the circle of watchers breaking up because there had been nothing more to watch. He gripped the long spear. It was a good weapon, better than the flint-tipped stick with which the boy in Chaka had hunted the great lizard of the rocks. His body curved into a half-crouch. He voiced one cry, the challenging scream of a predatory killer, and went in among the men. He did slaughter with that spear. They were not expecting attack. They were not expecting anything. Stark had sprung to life too quickly, and they were afraid of him. He could smell the fear on them. Fear not of a man like themselves, but of a creature less and more than a man. He killed and was happy. They fell away from him, the wild riders of Mech. They were sure now that he was a demon. He raged among them with the bright spear, and they heard again that sound that should not have come from a human throat, and their superstitious terror rose and sent them scrambling out of his path, trampling on each other in a childish panic. He broke through, and there was nothing between him and escape but 2 mounted men who guarded the herd. Being mounted, they had more courage. They felt that even a warlock could not stand against their charge. They came at him as he ran, the padded feet of their beasts making a muffled drumming in the snow. Without breaking stride, Stark hurled his spear. It drove through one man's body and tumbled him off, so that he fell under his comrade's mount and fouled its legs. It staggered and reared up, hissing, and Stark fled on. Once he glanced over his shoulders. Through the milling, shouting crowd of men he glimpsed a dark, mailed figure with a winged mask, going through the ruck with a loping stride and bearing a sable axe raised high for the throwing. Stark was close to the herd now, and they caught his scent. The Norland brutes had never liked the smell of him, and now the reek of blood upon him was enough in itself to set them wild. They began to hiss and snarl uneasily, rubbing their reptilian fangs together as they wheeled around, staring at him with lambent eyes. He rushed them before they could quite decide to break. He was quick enough to catch one by the fleshy comb that served it for a forelock, held it with savage indifference to its squealing, and leaped to its back. Then he let it bolt, and as he rode it, he yelled, a shrill brute cry that urged the creatures to panic. The herd broke, stampeding outward from its center like a bursting shell. Stark was in the forefront. Clinging low to the scaly neck, he saw the men of Mech scattered and churned and tramped into the snow by the flying pads. In and out of the shelters, kicking the brush walls down, lifting up their harsh reptilian voices, they went racketing through the camp, leaving behind them wreckage as of a storm. And Stark went with them. He snatched a cloak off the shoulders of some petty chieftain as he went by, and then, twisting cruelly on the fleshy comb, beating with his fist at the creature's head, he got his mount turned in the way he wanted it to go, down the valley. He caught one glimpse of the Lord Sieran fighting to hold one of the creatures long enough to mount, and then a dozen striving bodies surged around him, and Stark was gone. The beast did not slacken pace. It was as though it thought it could outrun the alien bloody thing that clung to its back. The last fringes of the camp shot by and vanished in the gloom, and the clean snow of the lower valley lay open before it. The creature laid its belly to the ground and went, the white spray spurting from its heels. Stark hung on. His strength was gone now, run out suddenly with the battle madness. He became conscious now that he was sick and bleeding, that his body was one cruel pain. In that moment, more than in the hours that had gone before, he hated the black leader of the clans of Mech. That flight down the valley became a sort of ugly dream. Stark was aware of rock walls reeling past, and then they seemed to widen away, and the wind came out of nowhere like the stroke of a great hammer, and he was on the open moors again. The beast began to falter and slow down. Presently it stopped. Stark scooped out snow to rub on his wounds. He came near to fainting, but the bleeding stopped, and after that the pain was numbed to a dull ache. He wrapped the cloak around him and urged the beast to go on, gently this time, patiently, and after it had breathed, it obeyed him, settling into the shuffling pace it could keep up for hours. He was 3 days on the moors. Part of the time he rode in a sort of stupor, and part of the time he was feverishly alert, watching the skyline. Frequently he took the shapes of thrusting rocks for riders and found what cover he could until he was sure they did not move. He was afraid to dismount, for the beast had no bridle. When it halted to rest, he remained upon its back, shaking, his brow beaded with sweat. The wind scoured his tracks clean as soon as he made them. Twice in the distance he did see riders, and one of those times he burrowed into a tall drift and stayed there for several hours. The ruined towers marched with him across the bitter land, lonely giants 50 miles apart. He did not go near them. He knew that he wandered a good bit, but he could not help it, and it was probably his salvation. In those tortured badlands, riven by ages of frost and flood, one might follow a man on a straight track between 2 points, but to find a single rider lost in that wilderness was a matter of sheer luck, and the odds were with Stark. One evening at sunset he came out upon a plain that sloped upward toward a black and towering scarp notched with a single pass. The light was level and blood-red, glittering on the frosty rocks so that it seemed the throat of the pass was aflame with evil fires. To Stark's mind, essentially primitive and stripped now of all its acquired reason, that narrow cleft appeared as the doorway to the dwelling place of demons as horrible as the fabled creatures that roam the dark side of his native world. He looked long at the gates of death, and a dark memory crept into his brain, memory of that nightmare experience when the talisman had made him seem to walk into that frightful pass, not as Stark, but as Ban Cruach. He remembered Otar's words, "I have seen Ban Cruach the Mighty." Was he still there, beyond those darkling gates, fighting his unimagined war alone? Again, in memory, Stark heard the evil piping of the wind. Again, the shadow of a dim and terrible shape loomed up before him. He forced remembrance of that vision from his mind by a great effort. He could not turn back now. There was no place to go. His weary beast plodded on, and now Stark saw as in a dream that a great walled city stood guard before that awful gate. He watched the city glide toward him through a crimson haze, and fancied he could see the ages clustered like birds around the towers. He had reached Kushat, with the talisman of Ban Cruach still strapped in the blood-stained belt around his waist. What's going to happen next? Stay tuned. And now it's tarot time. Because the festivities are calling, for this moon I'm going to use a super simple spread. It's so simple it doesn't even have a name. Okay, the first card represents the situation as a whole. And we have the Ace of Swords. This represents a new cycle of intense activity and creative and enterprising thinking, which basically just describes spring. The shackles of winter are coming off and we are ready to get moving and get the ideas flowing. Next up is the card of Hindrances, which represents the obstacles to your best outcome. We have the Three of Swords. This is a card of mental turmoil and sadness connected to past events. It can also signify a lack of communication. These are the challenges that we need to overcome, essentially shaking off the cobwebs of the past that want to keep us from getting out there and moving forward. Okay, now the companion card, the helpers. These are the allies on your path. So coming up is the 10 of Pentacles. This card signifies a new era of prosperity, expanded responsibilities, and empowerment. Sometimes being thrown into extra responsibility is all we need to get over the hindrances of the past, where we essentially just don't have time to be bothered with them in order to get things done. Okay, the next card is the worst case scenario. We have the High Priest. This is a card of education and greater awareness. Not so bad for a worst case scenario. We can always learn new things. Okay, and the last card is the best case scenario. And we have the 9 of Wands. This card represents the integration of myriad energies as well as strength and diversity. The key to this integration is to take your hindrances and turn them into helpers. You can use the lessons of your past events to feed your sense of empowerment. You survived them and you're here to take this world by storm. So let's do it. Spring forward, my bling. Okay, that's going to do it. I have to get back to the party. So don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe on Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And remember, every thorn has its rose and every blossom its perfume. So stop and smell the flowers. Bye.